What's up everyone, I'm Sublight Drive, and today I'm going to be building a model of this concept art of the Phantom Mark V, originally drawn by Tom Sun, also known as Sunny Rain. This will be the first project where I'll be using a new tool that I've had people recommending to me for literal years, and truth be told, I don't know why I've been putting it off this long. This here is a Silhouette Cameo cutting machine, which is similar to a Cricut, but without the exploitative subscription service. The first thing I used it for was to cut out a few paper templates as I was feeling out the proportions I wanted for the model, but the real acid test was seeing how well it could handle cutting styrene. The Silhouette software works fine, which is all I really need since I make all of my templates in Affinity Designer and then port them over. That said, it doesn't tend to retain the scale of the templates I upload, which will be an issue later. The first few cuts I made the mistake of thinking that the sticky backing sheet wasn't necessary since the plastic can hold up on its own, and unfortunately a few successful tests lulled me into a false sense of security because as soon as I tried to make a cut with the camera rolling, this happened. Me using the machine wrong aside, the cuts are clean and just the right depth for cracking, but I had no idea if it would work for a real project as I was snapping these out. As it turned out, I was super impressed by the results. They were honestly a lot cleaner and more precise than anything I could do by hand. There were a few corners that needed cleaning up, but nothing worse than if I'd done all this with a ruler and a knife. One aspect I was really looking forward to was seeing how the machine would handle cutting a hole or intersection out of a part like this. Doing it by hand, I always managed to overcut a corner or misalign something, but the machine handled it perfectly, and once I cleaned it up, I was super happy with how it turned out. Another small thing that the cutter turned out to be useful for is making gussets that are a clean 90-degree angle. I obviously could use this to make supports at whatever angle I wanted to, but that'll have to wait for a future project. Once everything is cut out, it's time to break out the Weld On and get to assembling. I'm going to start with the cutout section in the top middle of the ship here. Once the box is all closed up, I can use some gussets that I cut out earlier to connect the sidewalls. And honestly, it was around this point that I started kicking myself for not buying a cutting machine before now, because not only had it saved me at least a couple hours of labor cutting, all of these pieces were just falling right into place. The cuts were so precise. Things weren't totally perfect, so some sanding was necessary to get the two halves to fit together cleanly. Once the main form factor was finished, it was time to start adding some details. I didn't draw any of this up on the computer until I had the body finished because I wanted to be able to take physical measurements before I planned anything. Sketching out the shapes on the body is a great way to do just that. This big flat piece that I'm gluing down here is something that I could have never done by hand, not just because of the required symmetry, but because it's got that little curve on the end of it. I've free-handed some curves in the past, but nothing that needed to be this symmetrical or this precise. Once the top panel is glued down, I can bend it into place. Bending styrene like this is a bit of a dangerous game, but I wanted to try it here since I was kind of riding high on the cutter, making things a lot easier. If I were to do it again, I'd probably use 2 separate pieces and sand down the join to create a curve instead. I intentionally left the hole in the top uncut while I was gluing it down because I didn't want the plastic to split or anything while I was bending it, but now that everything is glued and cured, it can come out. One of the things I was looking most forward to with the cutting machine is making small, repetitive pieces like these vent vanes. For most pieces that I cut by hand, I can be precise down to about 0.5 millimeter, which is normally more than enough, but when you're making a dozen little trapezoids like this, the differences can add up really quick, and I end up with pieces that don't match. That's not to say that switching to the machine is without any challenges. One thing that I noticed is that if I have overlapping edges like this, a total non-issue if I were cutting by hand, the machine wants to go over those lines twice or sometimes even 3 times, and it has odd breaks in what should be clean lines because technically they're the edge of a line. So after I've arranged the trapezoids to minimize the number of cuts required, I go back over the shape and redraw it so there are no overlapping lines, and anything I want to be a long straight cut is a single unbroken line. Once the template is all properly reordered, I can send it to the machine to be cut. It was only after I did all the plastic snapping and arranging and assembly when I realized another issue that can arise when using the cutter, and that is that it's a lot easier to accidentally print at the wrong scale. Fortunately, it wasn't hard to resize the shapes and start over. The top engines are a quick little assembly, with the most interesting detail being the recessed sloped vents here in the front. From there, I can add a bit more surface detail to the top. I have an overwhelming urge to add panel lines even when the original art has none, which I managed to mostly suppress except for this one little piece in the top center. On the bottom, I had a bit more freedom to get creative, and I wanted to try a slightly different style of panelizing. A bit blockier, a bit more symmetric, and I'd like to try experimenting with it more in the future. I'm not about to let those little vents that I assembled go to waste, and I found a good spot for them here. Once the bottom was all detailed up, it's time for everyone's favorite, the big box of Greeblies. I'm starting with a little bit of wire to create a flow of lines that's closer to the original art, and then a few styrene pips. The styrene I'm putting in here I bought pre-etched with lines, and I love it for little details like these. Just styrene on its own can be a bit repetitive though, so next is kitbashing. I'm pretty sure almost everything I'm putting down in this section is one part or another of a little naval gun. For this section here, I wanted to again try something new with the cutting machine, so I had to print out a bunch of very small, very carefully shaped panels. I think this was finally starting to reach the limits of the precision I can get away with, but it's more because the plastic doesn't break cleanly at this scale, not because of the machine's limits. From there, all I had to do was fill in the rest of the recessed sections with Greeblies. Once I put the final details in the top well, it was time to prime. I was particularly looking forward to the paint job on this ship since it has a lot of bright colors and clean lines compared to my usual fare. The first paint to go down is yellow, and I'm not worried about overspray or anything since all of this will be covered up soon. Next is masking off the yellow, which is where I do need to get a little precise with the tape. For the caution stripes on the side here, I'm keeping it even by using a little bit of masking tape to space out the areas that are going to be covered. Once that's all done, I can put down a base coat of surface gray and cover up all that yellow overspray. The underside of the ship is darker than the top half, so now I need to mask off the whole upper half. The Greebly well along the center line is even darker, but I'm not as worried about this being super clean, so I'm freehanding it. We're not done with the color yet, though, because a few of the details on the side need to be painted red. The final color will be the blue accents, which includes the big blue 7 on the side of the ship. For that, I have this masking tape that's sized to go through the cutting machine. I think I had the settings wrong because it's not coming off the backing very cleanly, but I got it in the end. I was a little worried about the adhesion, but I think the results speak for themselves. And of course, now that I've finished all these nice, clean, perfect lines, I'm going to break them up with some chipping. I'm going to go in first with the lighter color along all the edges and corners, or anywhere else that it makes sense visually for the paint to be coming off. Then a darker color in the center of the largest chips gives them the illusion of depth. The front of the ship has these 3 glowing blue lights, which I wanted to replicate with just blue paints. I've tried doing object source lighting a few times on wargaming minis, but it's far from my strong suit. I won't pretend like this is my finest work, but I think it works well for what it is. The next step before I put on some washes is gluing down the top engines into place, which I'd been putting off to make painting easier. The last step is taking some black oil paint, thinned down pretty heavily with mineral spirits, and getting it all up into those nooks and crannies between all the Greeblies. It looks a total mess at first, of course, but wiping off the excess with a paper towel brings out all those details that were lost in the dark gray earlier. Once I'd given the whole ship the oil wash treatment, I called it done. Looking at it now, I didn't quite get the proportions right. My Phantom was a bit chunkier than the original art, but I feel like I did do a good job of nailing all the details. In all, this was a super fun project, especially getting to paint all those very bright and precisely colored sections. I was also more excited than I thought I'd be getting to use the cutting machine. I can already tell that it's going to change my workflow in a really big way, and I'm looking forward to the design space it opens up for me going forward. Like I said earlier, I really don't know what was holding me back from getting one before. It's really a spectacular tool. Now, if you thought that this was super cool and you want to try building your own spaceships from scratch, I sell templates and instructions for several ships of my own design that you can make yourself. I'll have a link down in the description to my Etsy where you can find those. Huge thanks to everyone who has already bought one. Not only are you supporting the channel so that I can keep making cool stuff, it's always fantastic to see what kinds of paint schemes and Greeblies and modifications you've all come up with. Thanks again for watching all the way to the end here, and I'll see you next time.